The census of 1960 indicated that about 18 million of our citizens, or some 10.5% of the total population, are Negroes. Since World War II, the struggle of these Negroes for equality in American society has been certainly the most spectacular and probably the most significant feature of domestic American life. But all the while the Negro has struggled for this equality, observers have been noting something of a change in his tactics and something of a change in the mood of millions of members of that people. The general impression has been that there is a growing militancy, a growing impatience with gradualism, a growing unwillingness to wait. Among the militant movements which Negroes have founded and built during this period, perhaps the most publicized and certainly one of the most important is the black Muslims. They are our subject today, where they came from, what they are, and where perhaps they are going. Our panel, here to my right, Mr. Malcolm X, minister of the Temple of Islam No. 7 in New York City, and generally acknowledged to be the No. 2 leader in the national black Muslim movement. Mr. C. Eric Lincoln, professor of social philosophy at Clark College in Atlanta, and author of the new volume, The Black Muslims in America, the first serious scholarly study of this movement, and a book which has been called by the authoritative Gordon Allport one of the best technical case studies in the whole literature of the social sciences. The distinguished American writer, Mr. James Baldwin, author of the novel Go Tell It on the Mountain and the book of commentary, Notes of a Native Son, and George S. Schuyler, associate editor of the powerful newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, and a man who has long enjoyed an international reputation as a journalist. Mr. Lincoln, may I ask you to start us, you as the author of this scholarly study, with a comment on what you consider to be the nub of the black Muslim program?
It would be difficult in a few words to set out the nub of the black Muslim movement because it is very, very many things. But I think for our purposes today, one could say that the black Muslim movement is essentially a movement of social protest, which moves upon a kind of religious vehicle. It's a movement among many thousands of America's Negroes, principally those Negroes who belong to the lower economic class, and a kind of a struggle to find their way and to find their place in the nation's society. Or perhaps I should better say, in an attempt to set up their own society, a black nation of Islam.
That would be its general approach. Could we get a little more specific? Mr. Schuyler?
Well, yes, of course, I have read this very excellent book by Mr. Lincoln, and I've been following the movement of Muslimism, particularly as expounded by Mr. X, for some time. I think that one of the bases, of course, for the anti-Christian, anti-white view is that the white Christians were responsible for slavery in the world, and that for this reason they are to be cast into the outer pale. Now that's one of the many falsehoods upon which this movement is founded. As a matter of fact, the Muslims carried on slavery for something like 12 or 1300 years before the white European Christians started it. I think that one of the outstanding slave traders in Africa, who has a monument to him in Zanzibar, is Tipu Tip, who devastated all Central and Eastern Africa.
Mr. Schuyler, before we get into criticisms of the movement, could we at first try to get on the table what precisely it stands for? Mr. X, would you like to comment?
Yes. First, though, I would like to point out that we who are Muslims, who follow the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, don't accept the term Negro. We stand against that. And I would like to clear myself, I'm not the number 2 leader of the Muslim movement because we don't think of ourselves in that light. We have one God whose proper name is Allah. We have one leader who in America here is the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. we are one people and we have one aim, and that's the upliftment and the betterment of our people here in America who are called Negroes, and where the objectives and the program of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad differs perhaps from the objectives and the programs and methods of these other groups that represent the so-called Negro. Most of the other groups, their method of operation has a tendency to lead us to believe that it'll take us another 1,000 years if we follow their tactic. Whereas we who are Muslims, we're not willing to wait another 100 years.
Well, now, in this uplift of the black man and unwilling to wait, what specifically do you want to do?
Number one, I think it should be pointed out clearly that as Muslims, we are not a political group, nor are we a civic group, but rather we are a religious group. When I say that we're not a political group, it's being made plain there that we are not relying on the politicians for a political solution, because experience has taught us that in the past the politicians have promised but never delivered. And if we rely on a politician, we feel we'll be going right around in circles like our people have been doing here in America 100 years since Lincoln issued the so-called Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, not relying on politicians, Mr. X, is it not correct that the Muslims seek to completely separate the black and the white man in America and to win and establish for the Negro their own homeland in several states of America?
Still, that's religion with us. If it was a religion for Moses 4,000 years ago to be missioned by God to separate the slaves in that day from the slave master of that day, complete separation, not integration, and still the Christians and Jews both today regard Moses not as a politician but as a religious leader and a religious man motivated by religion completely. We feel that what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is doing here in America today in demanding a complete separation of this slave from his slave master, and as Moses asked for a land of his own flowing with milk and honey, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad is likewise asking for a land for us flowing with the sweet milk and honey of freedom, justice, and equality.
Well, accepting as Mr. Schuyler.
Just wait a minute now. At the risk of going into politics, I would like to know how any group in the United States is going to separate part of the United States for them to live in without having something to do with politics. Do you plan to do this through warfare?
Sir, I don't think that it's necessary to bring about any warfare. If the ex-slave in America has to go to war with his former slave master to get what is his by right, then that in itself is a condemnation of the former slave master. If Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years ago, which means we're supposed to be free, we're supposed to be citizens, we're supposed to be protected by the Constitution that we fight and die for, and yet at the same time today, the so-called Negro is knocking at the White House door, still begging his master to pass legislation that will give him recognition or protection by the Constitution that he is supposed to represent him. I think, sir, that the man who is depriving him of these rights cannot open up his mouth and say that it would be war. It would be wrong to go to war against him to get these things.
Gentlemen, before we go further into techniques, if you will excuse me, Mr. Schuyler, I would still like to get out here the full program of the Muslim religion in America. We now have the desire for a separate grouping in some states of America. Mr. Baldwin, would you comment on your understanding of other purposes of the movement?
It's very difficult to talk about it in these terms, I think. I think that the Muslim movement is involved with power, and I know about power, but it's involved also with morality and identity. This is the argument I have with Mr. X. When Malcolm X says that actually he's got a very good thing going for him, the Muslim movement does, because after all, what they are asking for is what the country is also on the record been asking for. A total separation of the races is what Mississippi wants and Georgia wants, and on the basis of the record, what the country wants. Now, it isn't what I want.
Pardon me, doesn't Mr. X and the Muslim movement call for the separation of the races by having the Negroes all in certain states of America?
Yes.
Which is different from what the Mississippians want.
Well, what the Mississippians want is to have the Negroes separated while still working.
Well, still in the same state.
In the same state.
Yes.
You know. Well, this is why the one is talking really about the nature of power, and I think one's got to make this clear. What the Mississippians have or think they have is power. What the Muslim movement wants is power. And I don't think that we can talk about it unless we're aware of this distinction, because of this reality. Because again, what the Muslim movement is doing is simply taking the equipment, or the history really, of white people with Negroes and turning it against white people. Now, in this country today, and yesterday, it is terribly difficult to believe Americans have never proven that they really consider Negroes to be men. Now, from my point of view, this has done more to destroy white men in this country than it has done, quite apart from all these things we know about, the oppression and the ghettos and the lynchings and so forth. It has done much more to destroy the country than it has done to destroy Negroes. What I'm suing for, what I myself personally am suing for, is not a separation of the races. I don't believe in the first place in races. And especially in this country, again, one is not in the situation of the Congolese fighting the Belgians. One is in the situation, whether white men or black men want to admit it, of fighting one's brothers and one's ancestors. And this is a reality which, no matter how hidden, will sooner or later come to light. When one takes the road to power, it seems to me that the white world proves this. One ends up where the white world is. What has happened in the country since World War II has not been because white people have suddenly changed their minds or become more generous or any of those things. What has happened is the power is beginning to shift. My concern is what will happen. What will happen when I, a Negro, no longer have you as my oppressor, but I'm responsible, altogether responsible, for what is happening to me, what kind of world I want. Now, I don't want to see the history of Europe, the history of the Western nations, repeated for another 1,000 years with a shoe on the other foot. The handicap one has in talking in this way is that there is no way to use the record, the American record or the record of the Western nations to prove this point. All the evidence really is on the side of the Muslim movement. What one can quarrel about and must quarrel about is the issue and where this will lead and what this means in terms of human beings who are finally neither white nor black.
Well, now, staying on that issue, if I may, and establishing here in a way that we can all agree upon how the Muslim intends to solve that issue, is it not correct that he stands not only for the separation of the races in separate states, but is opposed to integrations, opposed to the sit-down movement? Schuyler, yes.
Well, there are two things here with which I differ violently. One is that all the evidence is on the side of the Muslim movement. That is in justification for this campaign of hate against white people. Now, I would like to offer that these 18 million some odd Negroes that you're talking about in the United States are the healthiest, the wealthiest, have the most property, the best educated, and the best informed group of Negroes in the world, and that includes all those in the Muslim country. Now, we ought to get that thing straight. This is a matter of record. You don't have to no guesswork about it. And the next thing is, where is there anything in the Constitution or in anything that Lincoln said or wrote that says that a group has a right to part of the United States to take it off by itself? I thought that issue was settled 100 years ago.
I'd like to respond to one of the remarks made by Mr. Schuyler. In researching the black Muslim movement and talking with hundreds of people across the country, one of the things that I found consistently was the fact that since Negroes in this country are among the best educated non-white people in the world, since they have the leisure time to some extent to read and to study, and since they live in a society where there are all of these plus values available to the white man, I found that this is one of the things that is most productive of the kind of anxiety that makes for a Muslim movement. For example, we found that the fact that the Negro is so well educated produces a kind of chafing at the bit because he cannot be a full-class citizen in terms of his education and in terms of his preparation. We find that with the emergence of black states in Africa and other non-white peoples in Asia and other parts of the world, that the American Negro has a sort of sinking feeling that if he isn't careful, he might be the last person in the world to attain the kind of status that would be equal with his education and his preparation. It is upon this kind of anxiety that the black Muslim movement feeds.
Mr. Lincoln, pardon me, Mr. Schuyler, before we argue over the point, the first thing I think we should do is to get clear what the Muslims stand for. Now, Mr. Lincoln, you were explaining why people turn to the Muslim movement, which is important, but as I understand reading your book, you say flatly that black Muslims are emphatically opposed to passive resistance, as expressed by Martin Luther King. Or another quote, Muslims have only contempt for the Negro sit-in movement. Now, Mr. X, is that correct or is it not correct?
America itself is opposed to passive resistance. They didn't, America has never, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, America didn't resort to
Pardon me, I'm not
resistance.
talking about America at the moment. I'm talking about you, Mr. X, and your movement.
Yes, sir. I want to clarify that because when they refer to us as non-passive, they make it look like we're committing a crime to be non-passive.
No, I'm simply asking, is Mr. Lincoln, our scholar on this subject, wrong or right when he says that you and your movement have only contempt for the Negro sit-in movement?
We have never voiced any contempt for the so-called Negro sit-in movement because we don't voice contempt for movements. But if
you use the phrase emphatically opposed, are you emphatically opposed?
We are opposed to forcing our way into a white restaurant where we are not wanted and forcing that man to serve us. We are opposed to that. Well, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was our religious leader and teacher, teaches us that it would be wiser for the black people of America, instead of begging the white man for what he has and forcing themselves upon him, to try and get something for ourselves. And for instance, sir, if I force my way into a restaurant in Georgia and force the white man to serve me, I would be insane to let him go back in his kitchen and prepare my food, and then I sit down there and eat it after he's prepared it out of my sight.
Perhaps I am being stupid, but it seems to me you are not answering my question.
Well, what is your question?
My question is...
Maybe I'm not giving you the answer that you want, the way you want it.
Is Mr. Lincoln correct when he says that you and your movement are emphatically opposed to the sit-in movement?
I say this, we are emphatically opposed to the methods.
How about the objectives?
If
you want an integrated society... If an objective is to sit down in another man's restaurant and drink a cup of coffee, when you don't yet have a restaurant of your own, then we have to be against that type of objective, because after that Negro comes out of that restaurant, having drunk the coffee, where will he work? Where is his job? Well, now, you are opposed to the means, you say, and I gather you're also opposed to the end because you are opposed to an integrated society. Is that correct?
The sit-in movement to us represents the intense degree of dissatisfaction that exists among the new generation of Negro and so-called Negro in America. As such, it is important because it shows that the present generation of students have lost their fear of the white man that was in the parent. 20 years ago, the average so-called Negro in America, if he resented Jim Crow or segregation, he would only manifest that resentment to the degree that he thought the white man would allow him to, or to the degree he thought he could do it without offending the white man. But
gentlemen, I have taken too much of the table's time. Mr. Baldwin?
I must say that this argument about integration versus segregation is just as unreal in terms of the Muslim movement as it is in terms of the Deep South or in terms of the country. In fact, one of the things in the record is that this has been an integrated country in spite of the fact that it's been illegal or sub rosa. Integration is not something new. Again, we're not arguing about... The aim of the sit-in movement is not to get a cup of coffee. It's not even to force oneself into white restaurants when it is not wanted. It seems to me that it has any aim at all. The aim is to liberate this country. And I mean, when I say this country, I mean both blacks and whites
Mr. Baldwin, now you confuse me. One can have two aims in life if one is a Negro. One can be to integrate white and black society and make it one society. The other can be to create two separate societies, one all white and one all black. If I understand Mr. Lincoln's scholarly study of the black Muslim movement, it is for the division into an all-white and all-black society.
I would like to say that another thing that the Muslim movement stands for, and with which I'm in complete agreement, is the greater interest in the Negroes acquiring an economic stake in this civilization. Also, in the fine work of rehabilitation they've done in some of their young members who have been juvenile delinquents and criminals, and they've come out, and by virtue of the teaching they received, they've changed their way of life. Now, that's been done by other movements. The Muslim movement has no monopoly on it, but they have done it, and you have to give credit for that. And,
so there is this economic problem.
Yes, and there's also the problem of...
Pardon me, Mr. Scholar, but to clarify the economic program, would you add whether you believe that the black Muslim movement wants the economic uplift of the Negro or wants two separate economies?
Well, I don't know. They may want two separate economies, but they are interested in economic uplift of the Negro, and I think that they deserve great credit for that.
Mr. Lincoln, would you answer that question, please, so we can get it clear?
My experience has been, and talking with the Muslim leaders about the country, that perhaps the separate economy for which the Muslims seem to be working is a means to an end. Whether the ultimate end is a reintegrated society, I doubt rather much. But nevertheless, the Muslims seem to feel that in our social structure as it now stands, that it is highly unlikely, if not altogether impossible, for them to have any real economic gains. Therefore, as I interpret the movement, they prefer to withdraw from a society in which they cannot move upward, to establish a society of their own in which there will be black men at all levels, and then, as I understand the movement, to enter into the same kind of political negotiations with the United States as exists between various other states at the present time.
As separate entities?
Yes, as separate entities, yes.
What about this issue of force, which we've got to get out here? One of the most discussed things about the black Muslim movement is the frequent charge that it is going to resort to force because it believes in black supremacy. And Mr. X, you are always quoted as having said, there is no white man a Muslim can trust. Mr. Muhammad is always quoted as having said, we must take things into our own hands. We must return to the Mosaic law of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. What does it matter if 10 million of us die? There will be 7 million of us left, and they will enjoy justice and freedom, etc., etc. It sounds like the language of force, is it?
Before you ask me to clarify that, I wish you would allow me to comment on Mr. Lincoln's last statement concerning the separate economy.
Go right ahead.
Although, as you say, he studied it, by me being a Muslim myself, I think I can make it more clear than the scholar.
Some of us scholars doubt that proposition, Mr. X.
Yes, well, I don't doubt that myself.
Yeah.
I think you'll agree with me, though, sir, that a separate economy already exists between the so-called Negro and the white man in America. Because there's a certain category in which black people can get jobs and a certain category in which they can't get jobs. The economies are already separate. There's only so high that they can go in various business fields. Some business fields are shut out to them completely. Even when a black man goes into business and he is in the selling business, usually if he has a successful business, he's only every sale he makes is a resale, because in order to have a commodity or goods to sell, he has to buy it from a white man, another white man. And which means that no matter how large his store is, still all of the goods that are being sold are being sold actually for the white man, because the black man who's in business is not a producer. He doesn't produce that which he sells. Now, we who follow the Honorable Elijah Muhammad are taught that the black man, even though he goes into business, will still be a dependent person economically, because he must produce. As long as the white man is the producer, then the white man is setting the price for the goods that the black man has to sell in his own neighborhood. Usually, When a black man goes into business, he doesn't go into business in a white neighborhood. He goes into business in a black neighborhood. And since he can only buy his goods from a wholesaler who is white, who gets it from the producer who is also white, he has to come back into his neighborhood and jack the prices up to get back the money from that the white man has already taken away from him.
This is your explanation.
I'm explaining it clear so that it won't be misunderstood. So Mr. Muhammad teaches us that in order for us to be economically independent, we have to have some land where we can set up our own factories and be producers, just like the white man is a producer for his kind.
Mr. Schuyler, you seem unhappy.
Well, of course I'm unhappy because I want to get back to the field of reality. There's something like 200,000 Negro individual farmers in the United States. They raise cotton, corn, they sell milk, and all of that, but they're selling it to white people, and white people would be very, very hard put if they didn't have this cotton and corn and the meat and other things that Negro farmers raise to buy from them. And so it seems to me that it's inherent in trade that you buy and sell. Nobody's stopping the Negroes from either buying or selling in the United States. Many of them are doing it all the time. And I think it's a perversion of the fact to say that Negro has no part in the economy. That's ridiculous. There must have some part in it, with 1,500,000 of them in labor unions throughout the country, and some of them in the highest categories that I know of. Would be too long to list here. Now, if Negroes have been able to devise ways and means of getting more of these jobs, that is partially their own fault.
But, sir, even though they're in these labor unions, they're yet the last one's hired and the first one's fired.
Not necessarily.
And the greater percentage of the unemployed right now here in America, according to Secretary Goldberg's statement, are the so-called Negroes, despite the fact that they belong to these unions and whatnot.
That isn't entirely due to the fact that they're Negroes.
I think there's something extremely misleading in trying to talk about the economy this way. In fact, as far as I can tell, the black economy and the white economy are interdependent. And it's quite true that Negroes are the first to be fired and the last to be hired. This is, however, is nothing. These details are obscuring the point at the moment. My question here is, how? I think it is. I think we take it for granted that the United States is not about to give away 6 or 10 states. Therefore, in one way or another, the only way this will be achieved is they will not be able to hold on to them. Now the question is, what happens then to this economy, which Negroes have, I think you say, $20 million or $20 billion at their disposal? This will no longer be so if the system under which it's obtained no longer exists, which is the only way these states can be achieved. Then what will the economy be? What will be the future of these hypothetical states? What will be their relationship not only to the United States, because by this time, as far as we can tell, there won't be anything resembling the United States as we know it now. It will be at least another country. It will be a very different country, and obviously a much less powerful country.
It'll be a black America and a white America, won't it?
Well, it is already on this continent.
Well, already, but there will be the blacks all in some states,
now,
whites all in others.
Now, if I can say one more thing, it seems to me this is somehow the hub for me, the root of the irreality here. The illusion of white people in this country is that they are living in a white country. And I think that is a very dangerous illusion. You don't have a white country with as many Negroes as we have had in it all these years, to say nothing of the effect on white people and the interaction between white and black people of this terrible history. For one has got to really face the facts of what really happened. I know about the oppression, the lynchings, and so forth. That is only what I know about the situation now. And I'm not trying to minimize this. But this is not all that happened. This is not all that happened. A great many other things happened too. A great many other things were achieved, and whether or not, I'm not talking about white goodwill, but the point is that history is also immoral, just as immoral as power is. But what history has produced, in terms of one's own personality, and choose the Muslim movement of being a hate movement, but I do realize, from my own vantage point, I'm a boy from Harlem too, how desperately and how deeply Negroes hate white people. Now, white people don't want to know this, and have spent all of my lifetime anyway protecting themselves against this knowledge. Negroes do not tell them this either. Now,
Mr. Baldwin, what I'm trying to find out is whether the Muslim movement does hate me or not, and whether it proposes to use force to satisfy its hatred.
It is not.
I don't seem to be able to get any place in finding it out.
No, it is not important to know whether the Muslim
I'll
movement...
clear that up.
It is not important to know whether the Muslim movement hates you or not. That is not at all the question.